Get out of my sight. Stop being a clown. My wife yelled as her male boss slapped me for interrupting his dance with my wife. Her coworkers stood smirking while boss accused me of ruining his company's annual party. But when the paramedics saw that my ears were bleeding, she immediately called for police backup. The MRI would reveal. Look, I'm gonna level with you right off the bat. My name is Mitchell Graves. I'm 34 years old. And until recently, I was the kind of guy who still believed in happily ever after like some kind of grown-ass Disney princess. Yeah, I know how that sounds. Trust me, I'm cringing just as hard as you are right now. But here's the thing about being a hopeless romantic in America. It's like being a vegan at a barbecue competition. Everyone thinks you're either crazy or lying, and deep down, you're starting to wonder if maybe they're right. So picture this. There I was, living what I thought was the American dream. You know the one I'm talking about. Meet girl, fall head over heels, work your butt off to support her dreams, and ride off into the sunset together. Except my version involved a lot more motor oil under my fingernails and a lot less sunset riding. But hey, love makes you do stupid things, right? And brother, was I about to find out just how stupid. My wife Clarissa, and yeah, even her name sounds like she belongs in some fancy country club, had this big dream of becoming a hotshot lawyer. Not just any lawyer, mind you, but the kind who wears designer suits and has lunch meetings that cost more than most people's car payments. When she told me she wanted to go to law school, I was all in. Hell, I was so supportive I could have been a sports bra. You go for it, babe, I told her, puffing out my chest like some kind of blue-collar Superman. I'll handle everything else. And man, did I handle everything else. While she was buried in her books, studying contract law and constitutional whatever, I was pulling double shifts at Murphy's auto shop, getting my hands dirtier than a politician's conscience. 60-hour weeks became my new normal. Weekends? What weekends? Those were for oil changes and brake jobs that paid time and a half. I kissed goodbye to every vacation we'd ever talked about taking. Hawaii? Nope. That money went to textbooks. The Grand Canyon? More like the Grand Canyon-sized hole in our savings account, thanks to her tuition. But you know what? I didn't mind. Not one bit. Because every time I came home smelling like brake fluid and WD-40, Clarissa would look up from her legal briefs with those big brown eyes and say something like, I don't know how I got so lucky. And just like that, all the exhaustion would melt away like ice cream on hot asphalt. I was building something, you know? We were building something together. 3 years of law school, 3 years of me basically living on energy drinks and determination. I watched her stress eat through finals, held her hair back when the pressure made her sick, and listened to her practice opening arguments until I could recite them myself. When she passed the bar exam, I threw her a party that cost me 2 weeks' pay. When she got the interview at Lansford and Pike, this super prestigious corporate firm downtown, I was the one who drove her there in my beat-up Honda because she was too nervous to drive herself. The day she got the job, she called me at work, screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. I got it, Mitchell. I actually got it. I hooped so loud that Big Tony, my boss who's seen everything twice, actually stopped what he was doing to stare at me. That night, we celebrated at Olive Garden like we were fancy people, and I felt like king of the world. My girl was going to be a successful lawyer, and I was the guy who made it happen. We were a team, a real honest-to-God team. But here's the thing about teams. Sometimes you think you're both playing for the same side, but it turns out one of you is wearing the wrong jersey. And sometimes, just sometimes, you realize you've been playing a completely different game the whole time. The first sign should have been when she started networking. Suddenly, there were all these after-work events, client dinners, and weekend conferences. It's part of the job, she'd explain, checking her makeup in the mirror one more time before heading out in clothes I'd never seen before. Designer stuff. Expensive stuff. The kind of stuff that costs more than I make in a month. When I asked where it came from, she'd wave her hand dismissively. The firm has an image to maintain, Mitchell. I can't show up looking like I shop at Target. The second sign was when she stopped asking about my day. Used to be, she'd want to hear all about the crazy customers and the impossible repairs. She'd laugh when I told her about Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick that somehow ran on prayers and stubbornness. But somewhere along the line, those conversations just stopped. My stories about work became background noise to her checking emails on her phone. The third sign, and this one should have been written in neon lights, was when she started getting embarrassed by what I did for a living. Not embarrassed like, oh, my husband's so humble, but embarrassed like, please don't mention what my husband does. At her office Christmas party, when someone asked what I did, she actually said I was between opportunities. Between opportunities. Like being a skilled mechanic who keeps people's cars running safely is some kind of unemployment gap. But you know what the crazy part is? Even with all these red flags waving in my face like I was a bull in Pamplona, I still believed we were solid. I still thought that deep down, past all the new clothes and fancy vocabulary, she was still my Clarissa. The girl who used to steal my French fries and laugh at my terrible jokes. The girl who said she loved how real I was. How I wasn't like all those fake, pretentious guys she'd dated before. Yeah, well, turns out real was just another word for useful. And once I'd served my purpose, once I'd worked myself half to death to get her where she wanted to be, being real wasn't quite so appealing anymore. But I didn't know that yet. I was still living in my perfect husband illusion, still believing that love conquers all, still thinking that if you work hard enough and care deeply enough, everything will work out fine. Man, was I about to get the education of a lifetime. So there I was, 3 weeks before what would turn out to be the worst night of my life, sitting at our kitchen table trying to figure out why my scrambled eggs tasted like cardboard. Spoiler alert. It wasn't the eggs. It was the growing pit in my stomach that had been there for months, getting bigger every time Clarissa looked at me like I was a piece of furniture she was thinking about replacing. I was scrolling through my phone, reading about some celebrity divorce where the guy got taken to the cleaners, when Clarissa walked in from her morning jog. And let me tell you, this wasn't the same woman who used to stumble into the kitchen in my old Metallica t-shirt, hair looking like she'd been electrocuted. Nope. This version of Clarissa was wearing some fancy athletic wear that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Hair pulled back in one of those perfect ponytails that rich women seem to master, not a drop of sweat on her despite supposedly running 5 miles. Morning, babe, I said, trying to sound casual even though casual had left our marriage somewhere around the time she started correcting my grammar at dinner parties. How was the run? She barely looked at me, just grabbed one of those green smoothies she'd been drinking lately, the kind that looked like liquid kale and probably taste worse. Fine, she said, which in Clarissa speak had become code for, I'm not actually going to engage in conversation with you because you're not wearing a suit that costs more than a used car. Then she walked over to the counter and picked up this sleek envelope. I'm talking expensive paper here, folks. The kind of envelope that probably went to college and has a trust fund. She held it like it was made of gold, which, knowing the law firm she worked for, it might as well have been. Here, she said, sliding it across the table to me like she was passing me a parking ticket. The firm's annual gala is in 3 weeks. I looked at the envelope. Lansford and Pike's logo was embossed on it in gold lettering so fancy, it probably had its own zip code. Inside was an invitation that looked like it had been designed by someone who charges by the font. Black tie event, it said, because of course it did. Because nothing says you don't belong here, like requiring clothes you'll wear exactly once in your lifetime. Black tie, huh? I said, trying to inject some humor into what was feeling like a pretty tense moment. Guess I'll have to rent a tux. Haven't worn one of those since our wedding. The look she gave me could have flash frozen a margarita. It's black tie, she repeated, like I was some kind of slow child who needed extra explanation. Don't embarrass me. And there it was. Not, I'm so excited you'll be there with me. Or we're going to have such a great time. Or even, try not to spill anything on yourself. You lovable klutz. Nope. Just a flat-out, don't embarrass me, delivered with all the warmth of a tax audit. I felt something twist in my chest, but I pushed it down like I'd been pushing down a lot of things lately. When have I ever embarrassed you? I asked, which was apparently the wrong question because her whole face tightened up like someone had pulled a drawstring. She turned away from me and started fussing with her smoothie, like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. Just try to blend in, okay? These people are important to my career. Important to her career. Not our future. Not our life together. Her career. Because apparently somewhere along the line, we had become she, and I'd missed the memo. What time does it start? I asked, checking my work schedule on my phone. I might have to come a little late. Old man Henderson's bringing his Cadillac in that afternoon, and you know how that goes. The The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife and served it at the fancy gala. When she finally spoke, her voice had that clipped, professional tone she used with clients she didn't particularly like. Try not to make a scene if you do show up late. If I show up. Not when. If. Like my attendance at my own wife's company party was some kind of question mark. Like maybe she'd prefer if I just didn't bother coming at all. I stared at her, trying to figure out when exactly my wife had been replaced by this cold, calculating stranger who looked exactly like her but seemed to have had all the warmth surgically removed. A scene. I repeated. What kind of scene would I make? Ask for the recipe for those little fancy crackers? Use the wrong fork for my salad. She wasn't amused. In fact, she looked like she was about to say something that would probably hurt both our feelings. But then her phone buzzed with a text message. Her whole face lit up as she read it, more animated than she'd been during our entire conversation. I have to go, she said, grabbing her purse and heading for the door. I'm meeting some colleagues for brunch to discuss the Morrison case. Colleagues. On a Saturday morning. At brunch. Because apparently that's what successful lawyers do. They have business brunches where they probably discuss things I wouldn't understand while eating eggs Benedict that costs more than my lunch for a week. Will you be home for dinner? I called after her. Probably not. She called back without even turning around. Don't wait up. And then she was gone, leaving me sitting there with my cardboard eggs and a fancy invitation that felt more like a warning than a welcome. I picked up the invitation again, running my fingers over that expensive paper. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, I'd put on a rented tux, try to blend in with people who probably spent more on their watches than I made in 6 months, and pretend like everything was fine. Pretend like my marriage wasn't slowly circling the drain like water in a broken bathtub. But hey, at least I wouldn't embarrass her, right? That night, I pressed my one good suit, the same one I'd worn to our wedding, and shined my dress shoes until they looked almost respectable. I told myself it was just nerves, that Clarissa was just stressed about work, that everything would be fine once we got through this stupid party. I had no idea I was preparing for my own public humiliation. Holy crap. I mean, seriously, holy freaking crap. Walking into the Fairmont Crystal Ballroom was like stepping into a different universe. One where everything cost more than my annual salary, and everyone looked like they'd been pressed and polished by professional people pressers. The place was so fancy it made the Ritz-Carlton look like a Motel 6. Gold chandeliers hung from the ceiling like expensive jewelry, each one probably worth more than my house, casting this warm, rich light that made everyone look like they were starring in their own personal movie about being ridiculously wealthy. The jazz music floating through the air wasn't some guy with a saxophone on a street corner. This was the real deal, a full band in actual tuxedos playing music so smooth it probably had its own financial advisor. And the champagne? Let me tell you, they weren't serving Andre from the grocery store. This stuff came on silver trays carried by servers who looked more professional than most surgeons I've met. I stood in the doorway for a minute, adjusting my rented tux that felt about as comfortable as a straitjacket made of itchy fabric. The bow tie was already trying to strangle me, and I was pretty sure the cummerbund was plotting my demise. But hey, at least I looked the part, right? Well, sort of. If you squinted and didn't look too closely at the fact that my shoes were from Payless and my watch was the kind you get free with the oil change. The whole place screamed prestige so loud I was surprised there wasn't an actual guy with a megaphone announcing how important everyone was. Ladies and gentlemen, approaching the shrimp cocktail table is Margaret Worthington, whose purse costs more than most people's cars. And there's Bradley Pemberton III, whose middle initial alone has more net worth than some small countries. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing server. Might as well start drinking now, right? And started scanning the crowd for Clarissa. It didn't take long to spot her. She was wearing this stunning black dress that I'd never seen before, something that probably had a designer name I couldn't pronounce and a price tag that would make me weep actual tears. Her hair was done up in some complicated style that looked like it required an engineering degree to achieve, and she was laughing. Really laughing. The kind of genuine laugh I hadn't heard from her in months. But here's the kicker. She wasn't laughing at something I'd said. She wasn't laughing with me at all. She was laughing at something her boss had just whispered in her ear, and let me tell you, the way she was touching his chest while she laughed made my stomach drop faster than a lead balloon. Franklin Maddox. Even his name sounded like it belonged to someone who foreclosed on orphanages for fun. The guy was in his 50s, with that silver fox thing going on that women seemed to go crazy for, all distinguished and confident like he'd been born knowing he was better than everyone else. His tux wasn't rented. Hell no, this thing was probably custom-made by someone who charged more for measurements than I made in a week. Everything about him screamed money and power, from his perfectly styled hair to his shoes that probably cost more than my car. And there was my wife, my Clarissa, hanging on his every word like he was reciting poetry instead of probably talking about quarterly earnings or whatever it is corporate lawyers discuss at fancy parties. One hand was resting on his chest. His chest, not mine, and the other was holding a champagne glass like she'd been born to drink expensive alcohol at fancy parties. The worst part? She looked happy. Genuinely, radiantly happy in a way I hadn't seen her in. God, how long had it been? Months? A year? When was the last time she'd looked at me with that same bright-eyed excitement? When was the last time she'd laughed at something I said with that kind of pure joy? I started walking toward them, my rental shoes squeaking slightly on the polished marble floor, because of course they squeaked, because apparently the universe has a sense of humor and it's mostly sadistic. As I got closer, I could hear fragments of their conversation, and it was exactly what you'd expect. Inside jokes about cases I didn't understand, references to clients whose names sounded like they belonged on country club membership lists, and that easy back and forth of people who spent way too much time together. Franklin saw me coming before Clarissa did. I watched his eyes flick over me, taking in the rental tux, the squeaky shoes, the general aura of doesn't belong here that I was apparently radiating like some kind of blue-collar beacon. And then, and I swear this actually happened, he smirked. Not smiled, smirked. The kind of expression you'd give a particularly amusing bug right before you stepped on it. That's when Clarissa noticed me. She turned around, and for just a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Annoyance? Embarrassment? Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't the, oh good, my beloved husband is here, expression I'd been hoping for. The whole scene felt like I was watching it happen to someone else. Like I was floating above myself, looking down at this guy in an ill-fitting tux approaching his wife and her boss, completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking into the kind of social minefield that could blow up his entire life. The jazz band kept playing their smooth, expensive music. The champagne kept flowing. The chandeliers kept sparkling. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a little voice was screaming that I should turn around and walk away, that nothing good was going to come from this conversation. But I kept walking anyway, because I was still stupid enough to think I belonged there. Still naive enough to believe that my wife would be happy to see me. Man, was I about to learn otherwise. You know that moment in movies when everything goes into slow motion right before something terrible happens? Yeah, well, real life doesn't give you that courtesy. Real life just smacks you in the face, literally, as it turns out, without so much as a warning label or a dramatic musical score. I walked up to them with what I thought was a casual, confident stride, though looking back, I probably looked like a penguin trying to navigate an ice rink in rental shoes. The closer I got, the more I could hear their conversation, and let me tell you, it wasn't exactly the kind of shop talk you'd expect between a boss and employee. Franklin was telling some story about his weekend yacht trip, because of course he had a yacht, and Clarissa was laughing like it was the funniest thing since sliced bread invented comedy. So then the Coast Guard pulls up alongside us, Franklin was saying, gesturing with his champagne glass like he was conducting an orchestra of pretentiousness. And this kid, couldn't have been more than 25, asks to see my license. I said, son, I've been sailing longer than you've been alive in this boat. Clarissa threw her head back and laughed like this was the most brilliant wit she'd ever encountered. You didn't actually say that to him, did you? Damn right I did. These public servants need to understand their place in the world. Their place in the world. Right. Because apparently being a Coast Guard, you know, someone who actually saves lives for a living, is somehow beneath a corporate lawyer who probably hasn't done an honest day's work in his life. I cleared my throat and stepped into their little bubble of mutual admiration. Excuse me, I said, trying to keep my voice level and friendly, though inside I was starting to feel like a pressure cooker with a faulty valve. I placed what I thought was a gentle, reassuring hand on Clarissa's arm. Can we talk? The transformation was immediate and brutal. Clarissa's face went from bright and animated to cold and annoyed faster than a light switch being flipped. She looked down at my hand on her arm like I'd just touched her with something contaminated, then looked back up at me with an expression that could have frozen hell over. "Not now, Mitchell," she said, and her voice had that sharp edge to it that I'd been hearing more and more lately. "Don't be a clown." A clown. She called me a clown. In front of her boss. In front of the man she'd been laughing with and touching and looking at like he hung the moon and personally installed each star. I felt something hot and uncomfortable twist in my chest, but I tried to push it down because this was her work event, her big important night, and maybe I was just misreading the situation. That's when Franklin decided to join the conversation, because apparently this whole thing wasn't humiliating enough yet. He waved his hand at me like he was shooing away a particularly persistent fly. "Back off, grease monkey," he said, and his voice had this casual dismissiveness to it that made my blood pressure spike. "This is a private dance." Grease monkey. This overpaid, overprivileged jackass just called me a grease monkey. Like fixing cars, like keeping people safe on the road, like actually working with my hands to build something useful, was somehow beneath him. Like I was some kind of lower life form that had wandered into his fancy party by mistake. I felt my jaw clench, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm her husband." And that's when it happened. Without any warning, without even a change in his expression, Franklin Maddox drew back his hand and slapped me across the face so hard that my ears instantly started ringing like church bells on Sunday morning. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot, cutting through the jazz music and the polite conversation and the gentle clinking of expensive champagne glasses. The pain was immediate and shocking. Not just physical, though my cheek felt like it was on fire, but emotional too. The sheer disrespect of it, the casual violence, the fact that this man thought so little of me that he could just haul off and hit me in front of a room full of people like I was a misbehaving child. But here's the thing that really got me, the thing that hurt worse than the actual slap, the reaction from everyone else in the room. Or rather, the lack of reaction. For about 3 seconds, there was this stunned silence where you could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. And then, I kid you not, people started laughing. Not shocked gasps or horrified whispers or someone rushing over to see if I was okay. Laughter. Like watching a man get publicly humiliated was the evening's entertainment, like I was some kind of sideshow act put on for their amusement. I heard someone whisper, "Oh my God, did you see that?" followed by a giggle. Another voice said, "Who let the help in?" More laughter. These people, these supposedly civilized, educated, successful people, were laughing at me getting assaulted. And Clarissa, my wife, the woman I'd worked double shifts for, the woman I'd sacrificed vacations and weekends and my own dreams for, she didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or rush to my aid or even look surprised. She just stood there. And then, and this is the part that's going to stick with me until the day I die, she leaned closer to Franklin and hissed, "Get out of my sight. You're ruining everything." Not, "How dare you hit my husband?" Not, "What's wrong with you?" Not even, "Are you okay, Mitchell?" Just, "Get out of my sight. You're ruining everything." Because apparently, me getting publicly humiliated and physically assaulted was ruining her evening. Me standing there with a burning cheek and ringing ears was the problem, not the fact that her boss had just committed battery in front of 50 witnesses. I stood there, swaying slightly, my hand automatically going to my cheek, and realized that I was completely alone in a room full of people. My wife had chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. You ever have one of those moments where reality hits you like a freight train carrying a load of pure, concentrated truth? Well, I was about to get the express delivery, and it came with a side order of medical emergency that nobody in that fancy ballroom seemed to give a damn about. I stumbled backward from Franklin and Clarissa, my head spinning like a carnival ride operated by drunk teenagers. The ringing in my ears had gotten worse, turning from church bells into full-on fire alarms going off inside my skull. My balance was completely shot. I felt like I was trying to walk on a boat during a hurricane while wearing roller skates made of butter. That's when I felt it. This warm, wet sensation trickling down the side of my neck. At first, I thought maybe I was sweating from the shock and humiliation, because let's face it, getting publicly bitch-slapped by your wife's boss in front of 50 people in penguin suits tends to work up a sweat. But when I reached up to touch my ear, my fingers came away red. Blood. Actual, honest-to-God blood was leaking out of my ear like my head was a broken faucet. This wasn't just a slap anymore. This was serious medical territory, and I was standing in a room full of people who were too busy sipping champagne and gossiping about the evening's entertainment to notice that I was literally bleeding from the head. The dizziness hit me like a sledgehammer made of vertigo. The fancy ballroom started tilting at angles that would make a funhouse jealous, and those beautiful gold chandeliers began spinning like disco balls from hell. I made a desperate grab for the nearest chair, one of those expensive-looking things with cushions that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and collapsed into it like a sack of potatoes that had given up on life. The conversations around me continued like nothing had happened. Like a man bleeding from his ear was just another Tuesday night at the Fairmont Crystal Ballroom. I could hear snippets of dialogue that made my blood pressure spike even higher. Did you see Janet's dress? Tacky doesn't begin to cover it. The Morrison merger is going to make us all rich. I heard the shrimp cocktail alone cost $15,000. $15,000 for shrimp cocktail, but nobody could spare 2 seconds to check if the bleeding guy was okay. Priorities, right? I watched through my blurry vision as several of Clarissa's co-workers, people I'd met at previous functions, people who'd shaken my hand and made small talk about the weather, literally turned their backs on me. Not metaphorically, but actually, physically turned around and walked away like I was carrying the plague. One woman in a dress that sparkled more than a Vegas showgirl actually pulled her husband in the opposite direction when they started walking toward my general area. That's when I spotted Brielle Matthews, Clarissa's so-called best friend from law school. Brielle was standing about 20 feet away, wearing a smug expression that could have powered a small city and whispering to another woman while pointing directly at me. Both of them were smirking like they'd just witnessed the funniest thing since whoever invented laughing gas. Brielle caught my eye and actually had the audacity to give me a little finger wave, like she was saying goodbye to a clown who'd just finished his act at a kid's birthday party. The room was spinning faster now, and I was starting to feel nauseous on top of everything else. The blood was still trickling from my ear, and I was pretty sure that wasn't normal post-slap behavior. I mean, I'm no doctor, but I was fairly confident that ears weren't supposed to leak like broken radiators after getting smacked around. That's when I heard the voice that probably saved my life that night. "Excuse me, let me through." A woman in uniform was pushing through the crowd of fancy-dressed rubberneckers like Moses parting the Red Sea, except instead of divine intervention, she was using good old-fashioned determination and what looked like legitimate medical training. Her name tag read Marisol Vega, and she moved with the kind of purpose you see in people who actually know what they're doing in crisis situations. "I'm a paramedic," she announced to no one in particular, because apparently nobody else in this room had bothered to ask if I needed help. She knelt down beside my chair and immediately started doing that thing medical professionals do where they look at you with serious eyes and ask questions that sound casual but are actually determining whether you're about to die. "Sir, can you hear me clearly?" she asked, pulling out a small flashlight and shining it in my eyes. "Any nausea? Dizziness? Both?" I managed to croak out, trying not to throw up on her uniform because that seemed like poor etiquette, even under the circumstances. She examined my ear with the kind of professional focus that made me realize just how serious this situation actually was. "He's bleeding from the ear," she called out to someone behind her. "Possible head trauma from that impact. We need police backup and an ambulance." Police backup. Ambulance. Suddenly, Franklin's little power play wasn't looking quite so amusing to the crowd. I watched as several people started shifting uncomfortably, like they were remembering that assault is actually illegal, even when you're wearing a tuxedo that costs more than most people's cars. Franklin, who had been basking in the glow of his alpha male display, suddenly looked like a deer caught in headlights if deer wore expensive cologne and had law degrees. "Now hold on," he said, his voice losing some of that confident swagger. "That won't be necessary. Just a little misunderstanding between men." But Marisol was already on her radio, speaking in that calm, professional tone that emergency responders use when they're not screwing around. "This is Vega, badge number 472. I need police and medical backup at the Fairmont Crystal Ballroom. Adult male, head trauma, bleeding from the ear following an assault." Assault. She actually used the word assault, and suddenly the room got very, very quiet. For the first time that night, someone was treating what had happened to me like it actually mattered. Someone was taking me seriously. Hospital beds, let me tell you, are not designed for comfort. They're designed by people who apparently believe that healing requires lying on something with the softness of a concrete parking lot and the warmth of a meat locker. But after the night I'd had, that uncomfortable bed in the emergency room felt like a five-star resort compared to standing in that ballroom full of human piranhas in designer clothing. The ambulance ride had been a blur of flashing lights and Marisol checking my vitals while asking me questions like, "What's your name?" and "Do you know what day it is?" Basic stuff that should have been easy but felt like taking the SATs while riding a roller coaster. The paramedic team, Marisol and her partner, a guy named Carlos who looked like he could bench press a small car, treated me with more respect and genuine concern in 20 minutes than I'd gotten from my wife's entire law firm in 3 years. Now I was lying here in one of those hospital gowns that apparently exist just to remind you that dignity is a luxury you can't afford when you're bleeding from the head. The emergency room was doing that thing ERs do, organized chaos with people in scrubs moving around like they're choreographed by someone who really knows what they're doing, even though it looks like total mayhem to us regular folks. Dr. Patricia Kim, a woman who looked like she was about 12 years old, but spoke with the authority of someone who'd been fixing broken humans for decades, had already poked and prodded me in ways that would be illegal in most states. She'd shined more lights in my eyes than a police interrogation, asked me to follow her finger while she moved it around like she was conducting an invisible orchestra, and generally made me feel like a science experiment that had gone slightly wrong. "We're going to need an MRI," she announced, making notes on a clipboard while somehow managing to look concerned and professional at the same time. The bleeding from your ear, combined with the balance issues and nausea, suggests possible inner ear damage. We need to see what's going on inside your head. Inside my head. Yeah, I was curious about that myself, considering it felt like someone had replaced my brain with a snow globe that somebody kept shaking. The MRI machine, for those who've never had the pleasure, is basically a giant metal donut that makes sounds like R2-D2 having a nervous breakdown while trapped in a washing machine. They slid me into this tube that was about as spacious as a coffin and told me not to move for 30 minutes while the machine took pictures of my skull. Easy enough, except my head was still spinning like a top and the machine sounded like it was trying to communicate with aliens using a combination of jackhammers and foghorns. But you know what? Lying there in that noisy tube gave me time to think. Really think. About what had happened. About the look on Clarissa's face when she told me I was ruining everything. About Franklin's casual violence and the crowd's cruel laughter. About how not one single person in that room full of supposedly civilized, educated professionals had lifted a finger to help me until Marisol showed up. When they finally pulled me out of the machine, which felt like being born again, except louder and with more medical equipment, Dr. Kim was waiting with results that made my night go from bad to holy crap. This is actually serious. "You have a ruptured eardrum," she said, pointing to images on a computer screen that looked like abstract art painted by someone having a bad day. "The force of the blow also damaged your left vestibular nerve. That's part of what controls your balance. You're looking at permanent hearing loss in that ear, and the balance issues may be ongoing." Permanent. That word just hung there in the antiseptic-scented air like a curse that couldn't be taken back. Franklin's 5-second power play had just changed my life forever. "You'll need treatment, time off work for recovery, and probably vestibular therapy to help with the balance problems," Dr. Kim continued. "This isn't something that's going to heal overnight." That's when Detective Ray Hale walked into my room like he'd been sent by the universe to restore some balance to the cosmic scales of justice. The guy was in his mid-40s, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested he'd seen enough human stupidity to last several lifetimes and wasn't in the mood for any more of it. "Mr. Graves," he said, pulling out a notebook that looked like it had been through several wars and won most of them. "I'm Detective Hale. I've been reviewing what happened tonight, including the security footage from the ballroom." Security footage. Thank God for the surveillance state, right? Sometimes Big Brother actually works in your favor. "We're filing assault charges against Franklin Maddox," Detective Hale continued, and I swear those were the most beautiful words I'd heard all week. Second-degree assault causing bodily injury. Given the medical evidence and the witness statements, this is a pretty clear-cut case. He flipped through his notebook, and I caught glimpses of handwritten notes that looked like they'd been taken by someone who actually gave a damn about getting the details right. We're also looking into possible charges against Lansford and Pike as a firm, he added, which made my eyebrows shoot up toward my hairline. If we can prove they encouraged employees to stay silent or tried to cover this up, we could be looking at obstruction of justice charges. I nodded weakly, which was about all the movement my spinning head could handle. What happens now? Now you focus on getting better, Detective Hale said, closing his notebook with the satisfaction of someone who'd just filed paperwork that was going to ruin a rich guy's week. Let us handle the justice part. Mr. Maddox is about to learn that money doesn't make you immune to consequences. As he was leaving, I realized something that hit me harder than Franklin's slap had. In the 4 hours since I'd been assaulted, my wife hadn't called, texted, or shown up at the hospital. Not once. I was lying here with permanent injuries, facing an uncertain future, and the woman I'd sacrificed everything for couldn't even be bothered to check if I was alive. You know how they say news travels fast? Well, in the age of smartphones and social media, news doesn't just travel fast. It goes viral like a disease with wings, spreads like wildfire in a fireworks factory, and somehow manages to reach every corner of the internet before you've even finished processing what happened to you in the first place. I found this out the hard way while I was still lying in that hospital bed, trying to convince my inner ear that we were not, in fact, on a boat during a Category 5 hurricane. My phone started buzzing like an angry hornet around 6 in the morning, and at first I figured it was probably just spam calls or maybe my boss wondering why I hadn't shown up for the early shift. But when I finally managed to grab it without falling off the bed, which took 3 tries, by the way, because apparently my sense of spatial awareness had decided to take a vacation, I discovered that I had 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and a notification that someone had tagged me in a video on social media. A video. Of course there was a video. Because apparently, while I was getting my face rearranged by a corporate sociopath, some genius with a smartphone had been recording the whole thing like it was entertainment. The video quality was surprisingly good for something shot at a fancy party. Clear enough to see Franklin's smug expression before the slap, crystal clear audio of him calling me a grease monkey, and a perfect shot of my wife's face when she told me I was ruining everything. The internet, being the internet, had already turned it into a viral sensation. #GalaSlap was trending, which made me feel like I was living in some kind of dystopian nightmare where personal trauma becomes hashtag material. The comments section was exactly what you'd expect from humanity's finest keyboard warriors. Half the people calling Franklin a rich jerk who deserved to rot in prison, the other half making jokes about mechanics who don't know their place. Real classy stuff. But here's the thing about viral videos in today's world. They have consequences. Real, immediate, career-destroying consequences. That's when I had to break the bad news about Milo, who'd lived a good long life, but had finally succumbed to old age about 3 years back. Watching Maribel's face fall was like watching someone tell a kid that Santa Claus was actually just their drunk uncle in a costume. Heartbreaking and unavoidable. He was 17, I said, trying to make it sound less devastating than it felt. Mom said he went peacefully in his sleep, probably dreaming about terrorizing the mailman one last time. I'm sorry, she said, and I could tell she meant it. He was a good cat. Grumpy, but good. After that, I found myself spilling everything. And I mean everything. The whole sorry saga of my marriage to Jasmine, a woman who'd seemed perfect on paper but turned out to have all the depth of a puddle in August. How we'd met in college, dated for 2 years, got married because it seemed like the logical next step, and then spent 4 years slowly realizing we had about as much in common as a fish and a bicycle. She was beautiful, I said, because honesty seemed like the theme of the evening. Smart, ambitious, knew how to work a room like a politician. But looking back, I think I was more in love with the idea of being in love than I was actually in love with her. What happened? Maribel asked, and there was something in her voice, not pity, exactly, but genuine concern mixed with the kind of careful curiosity you use when you're not sure if you're about to step on a landmine. Her personal trainer happened, I said, taking a long pull from my beer, because some truths go down easier with alcohol. Guy named Brad, because of course his name was Brad. Apparently, I was too safe, and she needed passion. Found out about it when I came home early from a business trip and walked in on them doing yoga together. Naked yoga. In our bed. Maribel's eyes went wide, and then she started laughing. Not the mean kind of laughter that makes you feel worse, but the kind that acknowledges just how ridiculous life can be sometimes. Naked yoga? Seriously? That's like the most cliched affair scenario ever. Did she at least have the decency to look embarrassed? Nope, I said, and now I was laughing too, because distance and alcohol have a way of making even the worst experiences seem kind of absurd. She just looked at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong by coming home to my own house. Said she'd been meaning to talk to me about our relationship anyway. Classy, Maribel said, and the sarcasm in her voice could have cut glass. Real classy. The divorce was pretty straightforward, I continued, because apparently I was in full confession mode now. No kids, no major assets to fight over, just two people who'd figured out they didn't actually like each other very much. She kept the fancy espresso machine, I kept my dignity. Seemed like a fair trade. That's when I told her about work, about Brent's backstabbing move, and how close I'd come to losing everything before she'd swooped in like some kind of corporate superhero. I watched her face change as I described what had happened, saw something that looked suspiciously like righteous anger flash in her eyes. Wait, she said, setting down her whiskey with the kind of controlled precision that suggested she was fighting the urge to throw it against the wall. This Brent guy deliberately left you out of the meeting invitation, and then let you take the blame for missing it. Pretty much, I said. Guy's been gunning for my promotion for months. Guess he figured sabotage was easier than actually doing better work. The look on her face was the same one she used to get when kids at school would make fun of her worn-out clothes. Quiet fury mixed with determination to prove them wrong. That's not just unprofessional, she said. That's straight-up evil. Yeah, well, corporate politics aren't exactly known for bringing out the best in people, I said, but I could feel something warm spreading in my chest at the fact that she was getting angry on my behalf. It had been a long time since anyone had been in my corner like that. We sat there for a moment, letting the weight of all these revelations settle between us like dust after an explosion. The jukebox was playing something by Tom Petty, the kind of song that makes you feel nostalgic even if you can't remember what you're being nostalgic about. That's when she reached across the table and did something that stopped my heart for a second. She put her hand over mine, just like she used to do when we were kids and one of us was scared or sad or overwhelmed by the general unfairness of being young in an adult world. Riley, she said, and her voice was soft but steady, like she'd been thinking about this for a while. I have to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Shoot, I said, though my heart was suddenly beating fast enough to power a small city. Are you seeing anyone right now? Because if you're not. She paused, and for just a second, I saw a flash of the uncertain girl I used to know, the one who wasn't sure if she deserved good things. Would you maybe want to try dating? You and me, I mean. See what happens. And just like that, the universe had gone from playing practical jokes to offering me everything I didn't even know I wanted. You know how people always talk about finding your missing piece, like you're some kind of human jigsaw puzzle wandering around incomplete until the right person comes along? Well, I used to think that was complete bullshit. One of those greeting card philosophies that sounds nice, but doesn't actually mean anything in real life. Turns out I was wrong, because dating Maribel felt exactly like that. Like I'd been walking around with a Maribel-shaped hole in my life for 15 years and just hadn't realized it until she filled it again. The first few weeks were surreal, like living in some alternate reality where good things actually happened to me instead of the usual parade of minor disasters and corporate humiliations. We'd meet for coffee before work, and she'd tell me stories about her rise through the ranks at Torwell. How she'd started as an intern making barely enough to cover ramen noodles and student loan payments, and clawed her way up through sheer determination and a talent for seeing through corporate BS that would make a polygraph examiner jealous. The secret, she told me one morning while stealing half my blueberry muffin, some habits die hard, is figuring out that 90% of business decisions are just grown-ups playing elaborate games of rock, paper, scissors, except they use PowerPoint presentations instead of hand gestures. She was different from the girl I remembered, but also exactly the same in all the ways that mattered. Still thoughtful, still kind to waitresses and baristas, and anyone else trying to make a living dealing with the public. still had that way of listening that made you feel like whatever you were saying was the most important thing in the world, even if you were just complaining about how the office coffee machine had achieved sentience and was now actively plotting against the accounting department. But now she was also sharp as a tack and funny in ways that caught me off guard. She'd make these dry observations about corporate culture that were so spot on, they'd make me snort coffee through my nose, which is both painful and attractive, let me tell you. Watching her navigate the business world was like watching a masterclass in professional competence. She never raised her voice, never lost her cool, but somehow always got exactly what she wanted through a combination of intelligence, preparation, and what I can only describe as polite ruthlessness. Meanwhile, back at Morrison Industrial Solutions, karma was finally coming around to collect on Brent's debt to the universe. Turns out, when you're dumb enough to leave a paper trail of your own incompetence, it's only a matter of time before someone notices. Talia Nguyen from HR, a woman who could find a needle in a haystack while blindfolded and probably enjoying it, called me into her office about 2 weeks after the Torwell incident. "So," she said, pulling up emails on her computer screen like she was presenting evidence at a criminal trial, "I've been doing some digging into this scheduling mix-up that almost cost us the Torwell contract." I sat there trying to look innocent while secretly wondering if this was some kind of trap, because in my experience, when HR wants to chat, it usually means someone's about to get fired, and that someone is usually me. Turns out, Talia continued, "Brent sent the meeting notification to everyone on the team except you. Which is interesting, because your name was on the original distribution list, but somehow got deleted before the email went out." She turned her monitor around so I could see the email timestamp and recipient list, and there it was, digital proof that Brent had deliberately sabotaged me. It was like finding a smoking gun, except instead of solving a murder, we were solving the mystery of why I'd almost become unemployed. Moreover, Talia said, and I could tell she was enjoying this part, this isn't the first time there have been communication issues involving Brent and other team members. Funny how these technical difficulties only seem to affect people he considers competition. Long story short, Brent got demoted faster than a lead balloon, transferred to a position where his main responsibility was organizing office supply closets and contemplating his life choices. Justice served, corporate style. But the real plot twist came when Garvey called me into his office the following Monday. I walked in expecting another lecture about quarterly projections or the importance of synergistic paradigm shifts, or whatever buzzword was trending that week. Instead, he offered me the promotion I'd been working toward for 2 years. "You stayed quiet and professional during that whole mess," he said, which in Garvey speak was practically a presidential citation for valor. "Didn't throw anyone under the bus, didn't make excuses, just focused on fixing the problem. That's leadership material." So there I was, suddenly sporting a fancier job title and a salary bump that meant I could finally afford name-brand cereal again. But the best part wasn't the money or the recognition. It was having Maribel to share it with. Our weekends became these perfect little adventures in rediscovering each other and our city. We'd hit up farmers markets and argue about which vendor had the best tomatoes, visit art galleries where we'd pretend to understand abstract paintings while making up ridiculous interpretations, and spend lazy Sunday afternoons at animal shelters, ostensibly just looking at cats, but really engaging in the kind of emotional torture that only pet adoption can provide. "We could get one," she said one Sunday, holding a tiny orange kitten that looked suspiciously like a young Milo. "My apartment allows pets. Are you trying to kill me with cuteness?" I asked, watching the kitten attempt to attack her earring. "Because it's working." "Maybe," she said with that grin that made my heart do stupid things. "Is it working?" Everything was working. For the first time in years, maybe ever, all the pieces of my life seemed to be fitting together like they'd been designed that way all along. Work was good, my personal life was better than I'd dared to hope, and I was spending my days with someone who understood both where I'd come from and where I wanted to go. The universe, it seemed, had finally stopped playing practical jokes on me and decided to hand out happy endings instead, and I was ready to accept whatever came next. You know how some people say that when you know, you just know? Well, those people are absolutely right, and also completely unhelpful, because knowing and doing something about it are two entirely different beasts. I'd known I wanted to marry Maribel approximately 6 months into our relationship. right around the time she taught my neighbor's kid how to properly pet a stray cat, while simultaneously negotiating a better deal on my car insurance over the phone. Watching her multitask acts of kindness and practical life management was like witnessing a superhero discover their powers, except instead of flying or shooting lasers from her eyes, her superpower was making everything around her better just by being there. But knowing you want to marry someone and actually working up the courage to ask them are about as similar as knowing how to swim and jumping off the high dive at the Olympics. The ring had been burning a hole in my sock drawer for 3 months while I tried to figure out the perfect moment, the perfect words, the perfect everything. Because if you're going to ask your childhood best friend turned love of your life to marry you, you better not screw it up with some half-baked romantic gesture that belongs in a bad movie. The opportunity finally presented itself on a crisp Saturday afternoon in early October, when the leaves were doing that thing where they turn every color in the Crayola box and make you believe that maybe the world isn't such a terrible place after all. We were at Mom's house for our monthly dinner tradition, something we'd started after Maribel and I had been dating for about a year, because Mom had basically adopted her all over again and would guilt-trip me into early grave if I didn't bring her around regularly. You know, Mom had said to me the week before, with that knowing look that mothers perfect sometime around their child's 5th birthday, the backyard looks particularly nice this time of year. Perfect for, oh, I don't know, important conversations. Subtle as a brick through a window, my mother. But she wasn't wrong. The hill behind Mom's house was where I'd spent countless hours as a kid, climbing trees and building forts and generally avoiding homework. It was also where Maribel and I used to sit sometimes during those golden afternoons when she'd come over after school, sharing snacks and dreams, and the kind of easy friendship that only exists when you're 10 years old and the world hasn't yet taught you to overthink everything. After dinner, I suggested we take a walk, trying to sound casual while my heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Maribel, bless her, probably thought I was just being nostalgic, especially when I led her up the familiar path to the top of the hill where you could see the whole neighborhood spread out below like a patchwork quilt of suburban dreams and middle-class aspirations. That's when Milo made his grand entrance. Well, Milo the second, technically, the orange and white kitten we'd finally adopted from the shelter after weeks of just looking. Mom had been cat-sitting while we were at work, and apparently he'd followed us outside because he had abandonment issues and possibly a sixth sense for dramatic moments. "There's my baby," Maribel cooed, scooping him up while he purred like a tiny motorboat. "Were you being good for Grandma Patterson?" Watching her with that kitten, seeing the way her whole face lit up with pure joy over something so simple, I knew I couldn't wait another second. The ring box felt like it weighed about 50 pounds in my pocket, and my carefully rehearsed speech evaporated like morning mist, leaving me with nothing but the truth and a hope that it would be enough. "Maribel," I said, and she must have heard something in my voice because she looked up from the kitten with those same expressive eyes that had thanked me for half a sandwich 20 years ago. "Yeah?" she said, and I could see her processing my expression, the way I was standing, the fact that my hands were shaking just enough to be noticeable. That's when I dropped to one knee, because apparently some traditions are too deeply ingrained to ignore, even when you're trying to be original. The ring box came out of my pocket like it had been waiting its whole existence for this moment, and suddenly everything else, the neighborhood below us, the sounds of traffic, even Milo's purring, faded into background noise. "Back then, I only gave you bread," I said, and my voice was steadier than I'd expected it to be. "Half a sandwich when you were hungry, and you looked at me like I'd given you the world. But now I want to give you everything. Really everything. My name, my future, my terrible jokes, and my complete inability to remember where I put my keys. I want to give you Sunday mornings and Tuesday nights, and every moment in between." I opened the ring box, revealing the diamond I'd picked out after visiting approximately 17 jewelry stores and questioning every life choice that had led me to understand so little about precious stones. "Maribel Vega," I said, "will you marry me?" For a moment that lasted approximately 17 years, she just stared at me. Then she started laughing, but not the kind of laughter that means you've just made a huge mistake, the kind that bubbles up from pure happiness and sounds like everything good in the world distilled into sound. "Yes," she said, and then she was crying too, which was confusing but also wonderful. "Yes, Riley. Of course yes, you ridiculous man. The ring fit perfectly, which was either incredibly good luck or divine intervention, and when I stood up to kiss her, Milo decided to weave between our legs like he was blessing the union or possibly just trying to trip us both. 3 months later, we got married in Mom's backyard, right there on the same hill where I proposed. It was a small ceremony, just family and close friends, exactly the way we both wanted it. Mom cried through the entire thing, which made me cry, which made Maribel cry, which turned our wedding into one of those beautiful disasters that you remember forever because they're perfect in all their imperfect glory. Even Jasmine sent a message, which I had to admit showed more class than I'd given her credit for. You look happy. I was wrong. Congratulations. Short, sweet, and surprisingly mature for someone who cheated on me with a guy named Brad who probably thought literature was something you found in a gym. We didn't need big speeches or elaborate ceremonies. We had each other. We had Mom beaming from the front row. We had Milo attempting to destroy the flower arrangements. And we had the kind of love that had survived childhood separation and grown stronger for the distance. And that, as far as I was concerned, was more than enough to build a life on. You know how they say life comes full circle? Well, most of the time that's just something people put on inspirational posters next to pictures of sunsets and motivational quotes about believing in yourself. But sometimes, if you're really lucky, it actually happens in a way that makes you believe the universe might have a sense of humor and possibly even a heart. I work part-time now at Kowalski's Community Garage, a family-owned shop that's been fixing cars in Millbrook since before I was born. Old Pete Kowalski hired me after a 5-minute conversation where he asked if I knew the difference between a carburetor and a catalytic converter, watched me diagnose a transmission problem on a 1998 Honda Civic, and decided I'd do just fine. No background checks, no corporate policies, no performance reviews. Just honest work at honest wages for people who need their cars fixed by someone who gives a damn about doing it right. The balance issues never fully went away. I still walk with a slight tilt to the left, like I'm permanently leaning into a wind that only I can feel. My left ear is mostly decorative at this point. I can hear some sounds, but they're muffled and distorted, like listening to the world through a layer of cotton. But you know what? I've learned to adapt. Your brain is amazing at figuring out new ways to keep you upright and moving forward, even when part of your inner navigation system has gone permanently offline. The funny thing about physical limitations is that they force you to slow down in ways you didn't know you needed. I can't rush around like I used to, can't take my balance for granted, can't tune out the world with both ears. But slowing down has taught me to notice things I used to miss. The way morning light hits the mountains, the satisfaction of fixing something that was broken, the value of conversations that don't have hidden agendas or ulterior motives. 3 days a week, I volunteer at the Community Recovery Center, mentoring guys who are rebuilding their lives after trauma, divorce, addiction, job loss, medical emergencies, or just the general ass-kicking that life sometimes delivers without warning. It's amazing how many different ways a person's world can fall apart, and how similar the rebuilding process looks regardless of what knocked you down in the first place. The thing about hitting bottom, I tell the guys in group sessions, is that it gives you a solid place to build from. You can't fall any further, so the only direction left is up. Some of them look at me like I'm selling them motivational poster bullshit, which I understand because I would have felt the same way 3 years ago. But then they notice the way I hold my head slightly tilted, the way I use furniture to steady myself when I stand up, the fact that I'm living proof that you can get knocked down hard and still end up somewhere better than where you started. And speaking of somewhere better, Marisol and I are still in touch. More than in touch, actually. Though we're both taking things slow because we've both learned the hard way that rushing into relationships is like driving too fast on mountain roads. It usually ends with someone getting hurt and a lot of expensive damage to repair. She moved to Millbrook about 6 months ago when a paramedic position opened up with the county EMS service. Coincidence? She claims with that smile that suggests it was anything but coincidental. She rented a little apartment downtown, close enough that we can have dinner together when our schedules align, far enough apart that we both have space to figure out what we want from life before we figure out what we want from each other. We have coffee every Wednesday morning at Maggie's Diner, which has become my favorite part of the week. Not because the coffee is particularly good, though Maggie makes a decent cup, but because Marisol listens when I talk, laughs at my terrible jokes, and treats me like a person worth knowing instead of a project to be fixed or a stepping stone to somewhere else. You know what I like about you? She said last Wednesday, stirring sugar into her coffee and looking out the window at the mountains. My devastating good looks and natural charm, I suggested, which made her snort laugh in that unladylike way that would have horrified Clarissa. I like that you're not trying to be anyone other than who you are, she said. No pretense, no fake personality, no carefully constructed image. Just Mitchell, take it or leave it. Take it or leave it. After years of trying to mold myself into whatever Clarissa thought she needed, the idea of being accepted exactly as I am, tilted walk, damaged ear, blue-collar vocabulary and all, feels like winning the lottery every single day. The settlement money is still sitting mostly untouched in conservative investments that will keep me comfortable for the rest of my life if I don't go crazy with it. I could buy a mansion, travel the world, or start some grand business venture. But here's what I've learned about happiness. It doesn't scale up the way you think it will. More money, bigger house, fancier car, none of that automatically translates to a better life. Sometimes the best revenge against people who try to make you feel small is living well in exactly the way that makes you happy, regardless of whether it impresses anyone else. So I fix cars, tend my garden, mentor guys who need someone to remind them that their worst day doesn't define their entire future, and spend time with a woman who sees me as a man worth loving instead of a problem to be solved. I read books I never had time for when I was working double shifts. I learned to cook something other than scrambled eggs and ramen noodles, and I discovered that silence, real silence, the kind you can only get away from city noise, is better than any music ever recorded. The physical scars are permanent. The hearing loss is forever. The balance issues will probably be with me until the day I die. But pain doesn't define you unless you let it, and betrayal only breaks you if you decide to stay broken. I walk with a tilt now, and my left ear is mostly just for show, but I've never felt more balanced in my entire life. Because sometimes what looks like the end of your story is really just the end of the chapter you thought you were supposed to write. Sometimes the life you didn't plan turns out to be exactly the life you were meant to choose. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, you discover that the person you become after everything falls apart is someone you actually like being.